92 degrees right now in Portland, and the heat advisory in place for Portland and surrounding areas starting tomorrow. Now to an excessive heat news conference, which just began.
So let's listen in to the Oregon Office of Emergency Management.
That at least 83 Oregonians at this point have been verified to have lost their lives due to the extreme heat event. This is an unacceptable tragedy. We understand that many of the folks who did lose their lives lost their lives alone, at home, and without air conditioners. Many of these deaths, in my mind, were preventable. It's devastating to learn that people were unable to access help despite extensive outreach and efforts to provide help and make resources available to Oregonians who could be impacted by the heat. But we need to ensure that any barriers that were experienced in folks getting to cooling centers or seeking medical attention, that those barriers were eliminated. That was one of the focuses of this after action review. As we head into this weekend, we are anticipating triple-digit temperatures across much of the state, and this has the potential to put our most vulnerable Oregonians at risk. We also need to remember that the weather events we continue to see, these climate-driven events, these are not anomalies, but indicators of the types of emergencies and disasters we can continue to face, whether it's wildfire, whether it's flooding, severe winter storms, and certainly fluctuations in temperature. We also need to make sure that we are not preparing for we are not preparing for yesterday's events, but we are preparing for tomorrow's events. Our climate is changing, and we need to make sure we're adapting to this changing climate. As we continue to recommend changes to the state's posture for emergency response and certainly to response to heat events, we also need to make sure that Oregonians are doing all they can to prepare for whatever may lie ahead. Developing emergency plans with your family and your communities, ensuring that you have a supply of food, water, medication, copies of important documents, and registering for the new OR alert system to get notifications during events is a really important part of every Oregonian's emergency plan. I want to highlight real quickly the four primary recommendations that we are recommending. There are 16 recommendations total in this report, but these are the four that have emerged as the most urgent and for immediate recommendation. We need to ensure we have increased health information sharing from our health partners, especially our healthcare providers in our community. Heading into that June event, there was a lot of messaging about the potential impacts of extreme heat and record-setting temperatures. Having access and being able to share the actual impacts in almost real time, being able to allow that data to drive decision makers will allow us to change our posture, provide additional resources if necessary, make sure that our local city and county partners have that information, and amplify our messaging, increase the urgency and quite frankly, the gravity of the messaging that we're able to share. These are not the potential impacts of a heat event. These are the real impacts of the heat event and how they're impacting Oregonians. We also worked during the heat event to ensure that the 211 call center was accessible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We need to ensure that moving forward. There was a delay or a gap in 24/7 211 coverage. That was rectified during the weekend, and moving forward during events like that heat event, we need to make sure that 211 service is provided around the clock. We're also continuing to have a dialogue with transit partners. Again, transportation should not be a barrier for folks accessing the help they need during an emergency. Waiving fares to ride public transit, exploring voucher programs with taxi and rideshare companies, all factor into the accessibility of transportation. Transportation, again, should not be a barrier for folks to be able to seek the help they need to protect themselves and potentially save their lives. We also want to continue to reference the importance of neighbors checking on neighbors. We know that lives were saved because folks checked on their family members, people in their community, and coworkers. We also know that folks checked on their community members or neighbors, or family and coworkers, perhaps in the morning, and by that afternoon, folks were having serious complications due to the heat, and for many Oregonians, it was too late. Checking on neighbors means more than maybe just a phone call. It means actively knocking on a door, driving across town to check on someone. And if you can't do that, calling your local emergency services for a public safety welfare check. These are all things that can save lives during an event like what we experienced back in June. It's important to note, part of the messaging needs to include the very plain message: heat can kill, and heat has killed in Oregon. We all need to be mindful of those risks and do our part to take care of ourselves and our communities. Finally, I want
Okay, you're listening to the Oregon state officials talk about the recommendations. These are officials from the Office of Emergency Management. As we are expecting another heat wave, but they're looking back on the deaths that occurred a few weeks ago in our last heat wave. Among the plans, Elizabeth, they're talking about they want everyone to have an emergency plan, a personal emergency plan for you and your family. They also say they're now adapting to climate change. They realize things will have to be different in the future. They want to improve the 211 calling system, make it 24/7 when people need help, and accessibility to public transportation. That's a key to get people to those cooling centers. This is all continuing on coin.com right now if you want to take a listen.
Certainly.